Good afternoon. Excellent. Welcome to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. My name is Jennifer Peppel, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs here. We do have a few people just coming in. Can you just hold up your hand if you have an empty seat next to you that anybody can take? And we will have, once our speakers take to the stage, we'll have a few at the front. If you're comfortable there, or would you like to move? Yeah. All right. No. Okay, excellent. So now to officially welcome you and kick off the session, I'd like to invite Khalil Sharif, CEO of Aga Khan Foundation Canada. Khalil.
Thank you, Jennifer, and welcome to you all here in person in Ottawa, and also to our global online web audience. Welcome to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. It's a great privilege to be hosting you here today, and I have to say a very particular privilege to be working with the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research, CIFAR. Many of you are here in this building for the first time, and I want to offer a special welcome to those of you who haven't been here before. The delegation of the Ismaili Imamate is a representational building for the activities of the Ismaili Imamate here in Canada and indeed around the world. It is the headquarters of some important agencies of the Aga Khan Development Network, including Aga Khan Foundation Canada. Collectively, the AKDN is a network of international development agencies that work in Africa and Asia on issues of the quality of life of poor marginalized communities. And we work across many sectors, including in education, from early childhood to higher education, in healthcare, in rural development and livelihoods, in microfinance, in private sector development, and indeed in culture, which I'm going to come back to in a second. When His Highness the Aga Khan and the Prime Minister opened this building, inaugurated it 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago, at that time they expressed a joint aspiration that this space be used to convene those conversations that would lift our horizons and our aspirations for the role that Canada might play in underwriting a more peaceful, prosperous, and pluralist world. And in line with that aspiration, we convene here on a regular basis conversations that help inform us and inspire us to be as effective a global player as we can. So for those of you who are here for the first time and didn't get your invitation from an email address that ended at akfc.ca, you should sign up on a list before you leave to make sure you can come to future events. It is a particular delight to be partnering tonight with the Canadian Institutes for Advanced Research, whom I regard as one of the most important knowledge institutions in this country. I think it is unheralded, but it is very, very important. Our relation with CIFAR actually goes back many decades to its founding, because Fraser Mustard, who was the founding president of CIFAR, was also a founding trustee of the Aga Khan University, and indeed served as a trustee of the university until his passing. And through the decades in which he was involved with the institutions of the AKDN, has left a very important impact in our work in higher education, but also our contemporary focus now on early childhood development, which was, of course, an incredible passion and interest of Fraser's. I should also express our gratitude to the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development, which is a constant collaborator of ours, who is supporting us in making this event possible as part of a larger effort to promote awareness among Canadians of development issues and challenges. Now tonight we've got a really interesting conversation with two world-renowned CIFAR scholars who will be talking about the importance of social networks and their relationship to well-being. And this issue is actually really interesting to us for a couple of reasons. Number one, our view of development is a holistic one. We think of quality of life in very broad terms, and it includes all the typical material elements of quality of life that you would immediately think of yourselves. But we also think of identity and security in one's cultural traditions as a major part of one's own well-being. In fact, we have agency known as the Aga Khan Trust for Culture, which is dedicated to the question of cultural preservation, not only as a tool for socioeconomic development, but also as a tool for helping communities manage the forces of cultural change in which they are engulfed. And in fact, we've got some of the physical projects of the Aga Khan Trust for Culture highlighted on these banners on our right, which talk a bit about how even in the most fragile context, a cultural investment can be a major driver of stability, of quality of life, when even in times of deep material scarcity. So very, very interested to see how scholarship in this area is advancing. The second area where we're very interested is the whole question of measuring quality of life. And we have recently embarked on a multi-year, multi-country effort to measure improvements in quality of life over time. And the assessments look at all the traditional development indicators related to health and household economy and education. But we're also trying to represent and measure more intangible things like voice and representation, social and cultural life, the level of trust that individuals have in members of their own community, what kinds of groups and networks they join, and how these networks build cohesion and resilience. So we have our own efforts underway to try to capture some of these things in measurable ways over time, and being able to learn from the most globally advanced scholarship on this issue is really interesting to us as well. So for all those reasons, it's a great delight to welcome you here today. I'm sure we're going to have a very rich discussion on these and other questions. And to begin it all off, I'd like to invite the person who leads CFAR today, a really extraordinary Canadian scientist, scholar, and leader of global knowledge institutions, Alan Bernstein. Alan.
Thank you very much, Khalil. I'm really pleased to be partnering with the Aga Khan Foundation on tonight's event. I think both organizations have so much in common, and an opportunity to be in this really beautiful space with these Kielhauer chairs here. That's an in-joke between Khalil and I, is just wonderful. My own experience with social identity and cohesion and well-being, I'll tell you a story, came out of a previous job I had at the Global HIV Vaccine Enterprise. And it was World AIDS Vaccine Day, and I was visiting a small fishing village on the shores of Lake Victoria, right beside the Entebbe airport. So to get to it, you had to drive under the runway in a culvert to this village that hadn't changed probably for the last 300 years. Mud roads, mud huts, maybe 300 or 400 people living in the village. And they were celebrating this event with all kinds of games and prizes. They couldn't be happier. But the fact was that 40% of them are HIV positive, malnourished, and who knows what other diseases they had. And I was struck and actually quite humbled that day by looking at the resilience of this group of people. And although I didn't have the jargon that you're going to hear shortly, or maybe not from our speakers, it really struck me that their sense of belonging together in this really tight-knit community, with jets taking off every 5 minutes from Entebbe Airport, loaded with troops and supplies to go to the Central African Republic and to the Congo, their sense of cohesion, I think, is what was holding them together. It was quite a moving moment for me. So I also would like to thank the Department of Foreign Affairs, Trade and Development for making this event possible, and from CFAR's perspective to Industry Canada for their long-term support for CFAR. I really am pleased, Khalil, that we're hosting this event together. I do think our two organizations have very much in common in terms of bringing knowledge and knowledge outreach to bear on issues that we both are concerned about, and important issues. Creating positive change in the world and bringing people together from very diverse backgrounds to share knowledge, expertise for common goals. In fact, as you've said, this is not the first time CFAR and Aga Khan Foundation have worked together. You've mentioned Fraser, and Fraser's Mustard's really pioneering work with the Aga Khan Foundation in all kinds of ways, including the founding the School of Nursing, and as Khalil informed me, really being an annoying fly on the Aga Khan's face in terms of really stressing the importance of health to development and to a sense of well-being and the importance of research. And we continue to have important relationships to this day. Over a year ago, the Aga Khan University formed a partnership with a team at UBC to undertake research on early development that would improve the conditions for children in Karachi. That program was spearheaded by the late Clyde Hertzman, who was a professor at UBC and is a distinguished CFAR fellow, and he died much before his time, unfortunately about a year ago. A little more than a year ago, Khalil and I were at a dinner at Rideau Hall, hosted by the Governor General, and the Aga Khan was there. And the Governor General discussed Why Nations Fail, a book by a distinguished CFAR fellow, Doron Asamoglu, and started talking about early childhood development. And then he asked the Aga Khan to say a few words. And the Aga Khan also started talking about CFAR and the importance of early childhood development. The Governor General then turned to me, and I wasn't quite sure what the agenda was for the dinner, but he asked me to say a few words, and I actually don't remember what I said, so I won't make it up. But I was a little perplexed. I thought this was going to be a dinner about something else other than CFAR, but indeed CFAR was very much on the Aga Khan's radar screen and spoke very warmly about it. Tonight's event marks the opening of the second International Conference on Social Identity and Health, organized by Kimberly Matheson and her colleagues, a member of CFAR's Advisory Committee and Vice President, Research and International at Carleton University. Researchers from CFAR and universities around the world have gathered here in Ottawa this week, sharing ideas on relationships between social identity and health, integrating psychology, sociology, and health research. I believe that the results of this research will open up new ways of thinking about how we can build a healthier and a sustainable world. Tonight we will also hear from two CFAR fellows who will share insights from their research into identity. They're part of a CFAR program that has really gained worldwide acclaim for showing how civic engagement, strong social connections, good health, and high-quality government are greater determinants of a society's well-being than simply economic wealth. That program is called Social Interactions, Identity, and Well-Being, I think is a superb example of the outstanding research that CFAR is making possible. Our mission, simply put, is to bring together extraordinary researchers from across Canada and around the world and enable them to address questions of importance to Canada and to the world. We currently have 11 programs ranging from cosmology and gravity to successful societies, to child and brain development, to quantum materials, and so on. These programs in total connect almost 400 fellows from 16 countries. The four things all our programs have in common are that they ask, first, questions of importance to the world. Second, they bring together extraordinary researchers, really people who are leaders in their field. Third, they are amazingly interdisciplinary in their perspectives and their composition. And finally, they are international. A little over half of our fellows are Canadian. The others, of course, are not. CFAR is very fortunate to have an outstanding and truly dedicated board of directors. And in that regard, I'm very pleased to recognize Frank O'Day, a member of our board, who is right over there. Thanks, Frank. Welcome. And I'm also really pleased to welcome Chris Dodge, the wife of our chair of our board, David Dodge, in the back row over here. Welcome, Chris. And I also now would like to introduce our moderator for tonight's event, Helen Branswell, who will introduce the speakers and lead the conversation with them after their presentations. Helen has been a medical and science reporter for the Canadian Press since June of 2000. That's an important date for me because that's the date I became president of CIHR. So we both started our most recent careers or other careers at the same time, Helen. Her career spans more than 30 years, and she's covered really a wide array of subjects Most importantly, I would say, is research. Her current work focuses heavily on infectious diseases, notably avian and pandemic influenza, SARS back in the 2000s, 10 years ago, and the new MERS emerging virus. In 2004, Helen was awarded the Knight Public Health Journalism Fellowship at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in Atlanta, and has spent 3 months working with scientists there. As the 2011 Neiman Global Health Fellow, she spent an academic year at Harvard focusing on polio and polio eradication. Her interest in polio led her on a world tour from India to Israel to Finland to understand the issues surrounding polio vaccines and vaccination and polio eradication. Her research resulted in a feature story in Scientific American. In short, Helen is a serious reporter. She covers topics in depth with a seriousness that is all too missing, I think, in the Canadian journalism scene, particularly in research. So I've known Helen for many years, starting when I was at CIHR. She has a curious mind. She's tenacious. She thinks deeply about issues. And I think we all owe a debt of gratitude to her for the many, many years she has spent working to bring information on health research to the public's attention. And I'm really, truly delighted, Helen, that you've agreed to moderate tonight's discussion. Over to you.
Whew, I'm not anywhere near that impressive. It sounded good, though. Hi, and thank you for joining us this evening. I think it's going to be really interesting. I hope that it will be, and I hope that you're already going to start, the minute I get off the stage and Alex takes it, that you'll start thinking about the questions you want to answer, or ask him and John later, because while I am going to pose some questions, my goal is to speak as little as possible here today. I really would like that you have a chance to ask questions, and then we'll facilitate an interesting discussion. We're going to begin this evening with Alex Haslam. Dr. Haslam is a social psychologist and an Australian Laureate Fellow at the University of Queensland. He's also a Senior Fellow of CIFAR's Social Interactions, Identity and Wellbeing program. His work focuses on how social identities and group memberships influence our interactions with others. He researches questions like, how does belonging to groups and organizations shape the way we think, feel, and behave? And how do individuals and groups in turn shape the nature of organizations and society? Dr. Haslam's approaches these questions by identifying and explaining how people's memberships in groups and teams affects a range of social and organizational processes, including stereotyping and prejudice, leadership and motivation, communications and decision-making, as well as stress and mental health. He's on the editorial board of 7 international journals, including Scientific American Mind. He's published and edited 11 books on social and organizational psychology, including the seminal book, The Social Cure, Identity, Health, and Well-Being. He's received numerous honors for his work, including the British Psychological Society's Award for Excellence in the Teaching of Psychology, and a National Teaching Fellowship from Australia's Higher Education Academy. Our second speaker is John Barry, a cross-cultural psychologist. Dr. Barry is a member of the advisory board of CIFAR's Social Interactions, Identity and Wellbeing program. His research centers on 2 interrelated areas. The first is the examination of how individual behavior is developed and displayed in different cultural contexts, mainly in relation to Indigenous peoples in Canada, Africa, and Asia. The second focus of his work involves immigration and ethno-cultural groups that have settled into plural societies in many parts of the world. Here his focus is on the complex interplay between the culture and behavioral attributes rooted in an individual's heritage culture, those of the society that they settle into, and how these relationships influence the well-being of both populations. Dr. Barry is currently a professor emeritus of psychology at Queen's University and is cross-appointed to the National Research University Higher School of Economics in Moscow. He's published over 30 books in the areas of cross-cultural, social, and cognitive psychology with various colleagues. He's a fellow of the Canadian Psychological Association, the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study, the International Association for Cross-Cultural Psychology, and the International Academy for Intercultural Research. As well, he's worked for years with the International Center for Advancement of Community-Based Rehabilitation at Queen's. The work he does there has a bearing on the discussion that we're going to have tonight, and I'm hoping that later we're going to be able to tease some information about that out of him in the Q&A. Now I'll give the floor to Alex.
Well, thank you very much for that welcome, and very much for the sort of generosity of those sentiments, and thank you very much for the various sponsors of this meeting. Most particularly, of course, thank you to CFAR for making the research collaborations that I'm going to talk about possible. This stream of research has been funded over a period now of 8 years, and I think it's brought together people from around the world. It's led to many, I think, important conversations that I think have led to, I think, seminal changes in the kinds of topics and issues that we're going to talk about. But again, tonight I think is really, as has just been said, really an opportunity to have another of those conversations. And I want to say too that this work is ongoing and it's very, very collaborative. So I'm here really on behalf of a host of other people, and you'll see their names fleetingly mentioned in my slides, who've contributed to this. It's a worldwide effort, and again, I think it's made possible by the leadership of visionary institutions like the Aga Khan Foundation and like particularly CFAR. So I think it's incredibly important to recognize that support, because I'm also aware that it's always a decision about what you support. In my country, in Australia, the current government has made a decision not to support these kinds of activities, and I think the consequences of failing to make those kinds of decisions are as consequential and have as much import as the decision to make the right kinds of decisions. So let's just start. The topic of my talk is why social identity matters to health. So this evening and this afternoon, which was on Indigenous health, and tomorrow, which is about resilience, and then the meeting afterwards, the main CFAR meeting, are all centered on this topic of social identity. Again, if you've talked about health, thought about health as you all have, you've probably never thought about social identity, you probably never knew what social identity was, but you've never thought, oh, in order to understand health, I need to understand social identity. All I want to do tonight is to persuade you that you cannot understand health without understanding social identity. That's quite a profound proposition, and it's a controversial one in many ways, but it's just an idea that I want you to at least fleetingly entertain. Okay, what does it mean to be human? Okay. At core, what makes us human is the fact that we're social animals. We enjoy getting together in groups. Actually, in many ways, this is where we feel most comfortable. It's where we feel kind of most at home, most able to be ourselves in many ways. And it's not an accident that we kind of congregate in groups and that we experience the kinds of positive emotions that we do when we're in those situations. As humans, we are indeed members of many different groups: cultural groups, political groups, national groups, religious groups, family groups, work groups, recreational groups, or interest groups. And those group memberships are central to our sense of who we are. They furnish us with a sense of identity and a sense of self. And that's what, when we talked about social identity, what we mean is that sense of we-ness, that sense of being part of a particular cultural group, part of a particular sense of being a member of an interest group or so on. Being Canadian, being Australian, okay? And when we think about those groups, we don't just think about those people out there psychologically, we internalize those groups as part of who we are. So when we say we and us, it's not just a figure of speech, we're talking about the self. And the self, when psychologists routinely talk about it, is written in the first person singular as I and me, and yet our work is very much about saying the we and the us of identity is every bit as important. In fact, as I want to suggest, it's more important. We get more stability, more well-being through that collective sense of self, that sense of usness, than indeed from our sense of I-ness. What is social identity? Well, as I've already said, social identity is the sense of self that's derived from membership in a social group. So when we see ourselves as a member of a group, that brings us together within this sense of common group membership, and it involves internalizing the group as part of the self, as part of us. That's qualitatively different from and irreducible to the personal identity, our sense of ourselves as individuals, if you like, as I and me. That's very important, but interestingly, while we often see the I and the me, the kind of individualistic model of self as kind of paramount, actually the empirical evidence suggests that it's, and Yolanda, who's in the audience, is one of the people who's pioneered this work, suggests that actually we only get a sense of I and me through our group memberships. So when do we feel most fulfilled as individuals is when we're comfortable in groups that matter to us. So for example, when you're with your family, or when you're with your colleagues and having a discussion about something that really matters to you, or when you feel proud to be Canadian. And actually it's when you live a full and rich group life that you achieve your, if you like, you're most comfortable with who you are as an individual. So personal identity emerges from social identity. Now, what is going on when we think of the self in terms of group membership, critically, is that it turns other into self. So if you think about the person who's sitting next to you, there's a good chance you may not have met them before, the person sitting behind you. If you met them on the street and you're just thinking in terms of personal identity, you've got no connection to them, and you've got nothing to do with them. But in this context, where you share identity as a member of the scientific community, or some member of CFA, or a supporter of CFA, or whatever it is, you feel some bond with them, and they're no longer other, they're part of you in this context, they're part of us. And that process, that translational process of turning others into self, has a whole range of important consequences. Most particularly, it's a basis for group behavior. It's once you see other people as part of the self that you can start to communicate with them, you trust them, you start to build connections with them, you have a sense of solidarity, you are able to influence them and be influenced by them. It's a basis for organization, all of these peculiarly human attributes, and it's also a basis for a sense of power and empowerment. Now, those things are important in terms of a kind of a health agenda, because each of those things has implications for health and well-being. So a sense of trust, you feel comfortable, and so on, and solidarity, all of those things feed into processes like self-esteem, like control, like belonging, like support, coping, resilience, purpose, and meaning. And actually, all of those names, a lot of those people who are in the room today, have all contributed in different ways to demonstrations of those specific links. So through a sense of identity, we have a sense of trust, and that gives us confidence and, for example, a sense of belonging, and all of those things are then feeding into a sense of well-being, and then down into things like resilience, which are manifested in terms of health behavior and health outcomes. If you want to kind of put those things together, one of the important kind of points of this framework is that rather than in psychology, we often have superficial differences between subdisciplines of social psychology, organizational psychology, clinical psychology. What it suggests is all of those things are interrelated and they kind of feed into each other. So social identity is a basis for a sense of connection, organization, community, which feeds into a sense of support, of voice, and an ability to cope. That provides a sense of control, a sense of purpose and meaning, which feeds into health and well-being, and then feeds back into increased sense of social identity. That's what we call the virtuous circle of social identification. And again, all of those links have been give us time, and we could, well, as we will in the next few days, talk about each of those links in great depth. But I think those are increasingly well-established links. And again, this bigger picture of resilience and empowerment built around this sense of usness is, I think, an important part of what I've got to say. The counterpoint to that is, of course, if social identity is kind of good for health, then a lack of social identity or a loss of social identity should be, as a corollary, bad for health. And we live in a world in which, in lots of contexts, social identity is under threat. It's threatened in many different forms, for example, by adverse life events, by stigma. We talked a lot today about racism, and by life transition. So at an individual level, we're all going to experience aging, and with that, we potentially lose valued identities. Some people experience unemployment, again, has a kind of devastating impact on your sense of self, your certainty about who you are and your place in the world. Again, if you're a victim of discrimination, and again, we talked today about colonization. These are all things which potentially rob people of their valued identities. And as a consequence, these pose and are well understood as representing major threats to both health and well-being. And indeed, the statistics from the World Health Organization about the consequences, for example, of unemployment or of discrimination on health, I think are very telling in that respect. So John was just saying earlier that about 60% of health costs can be attributed to disadvantage associated with having a kind of marginalized or disadvantaged or compromised identity in some sense. So the counterpoint to the virtuous circle of social identification is the vicious circle of social atomization, in which a lack of social identity speaks to disconnection, or leads to disconnection, isolation, alienation, disempowerment, lack of support, frustration, anomie, and then distress, depression, and dysfunction, and then again, an increased sense of isolation. Okay. I should say, too, there's a kind of growing empirical evidence that social identity plays a key role in these processes. And again, I've said already there's been an increased influence of this work over the years, but you can see the kind of spike in recent years. The book that was referred to was attributed to me, but it was actually written by, or authored by, edited by Yolanda and Kath, but also many other people who are in this room. And I think that research, much of which we're going to talk about, connects social identity to the health benefits of the environment, the physical environment you live in, exercise, as well as things like religion, spirituality, mass gatherings, crowds, and again, religious gatherings. It also links it to depression and mental health. One of my slides a minute ago had gone missing in action, and that slide I was only going to give you one fact tonight, and this is the fact. It comes from work of a colleague of ours, Tegan, at the University of Queensland. And basically, if you have a history of depression and you are in no groups, if you join one social group, you reduce your risk of depression relapse by 24%. And if you join 3 groups, you reduce it by 63%. And that compares massively, is massively better than the kind of risk of remission associated with standard pharmaceutical interventions. And finally, too, also this work says that, and speaks to, and this leads into what John is going to talk about, the success of aid and development projects, as well as the leadership that allows them and other interventions to succeed. And again, I think leadership around these issues is another major theme of our work. Also, this burgeoning interest provides the platform for this week's meeting, which brings together theorists and practitioners to talk around a range of issues associated with testing, applying and elaborating the connections between an identity and health in relation to a large range of health topics. So we're going to talk about interventions to improve health. We're going to talk about moderators of improved health, things like culture and biology and other kinds of factors, because there is obviously an interface between psychology and medicine that I think is increasingly seen as critical, but is at this point poorly understood. The importance of these issues for marginalized groups in particular, and also ways of mobilizing shared identities with a view to promoting positive health outcomes. This work, I think, brings robust and rich and integrative theory to bear on a range of phenomena that I think are known to be central to health. So there is already a lot of literature on the importance of social connectedness and social relations to health. What has, I think, been lacking is an integrative theoretical perspective that explains all of those links. And I think it's precisely because of the work that we're doing that's linking epidemiology and social perspectives on medicine with economics and other kind of disciplinary interests that makes what we're doing so powerful. I think, too, this work shows that a neglect of social identity dynamics leads to suboptimal outcomes. But the power of groups, which is routinely overlooked, can be harnessed to deliver significant health benefits. The point of this picture, this is obviously the scream, Munch is the scream, is that often when we see that picture, we focus on the traumatized individual. How many people in the audience have seen that picture and never noticed that there were two people in the background? Okay. The point of that picture, if you read about it in Munch's writings, was really about the relationship between the individual and the group. And most of the theorizing around that work of art is, who are those people? And what is their relation to that person? And what role did they play in making him or her, because they're kind of amorphous identity in some ways, traumatized? And what are they going to help them or not? And I think it's interesting too, there are 4 versions of the scream, and they're always in every picture. So there's no, it wasn't just an accident, they're only there in some versions. I think, though, if we just focus on individual sufferers alone and the plight of individuals, or indeed look at it at another level, just at a holistic societal level, and we miss out this intermediate role played by specific group memberships, I think, again, we miss out on a lot. And what we kind of need to do is kind of recontextualize the group, have a psychology of self which brings the group into the frame and sees them as central to processes of rehabilitation, remediation, and so on. I should say, too, that this work is part of what we might call broadly speaking, an applied social identity approach. And again, I think, actually, I would pay tribute to CFAR here. When I and my colleagues started 8 years ago, and I was very much a theoretical social psychologist, and I knew that what we were studying had relevance to all the things I've talked about, communication and influence. And it was only actually, to some extent, I think, by having the kinds of conversations that CFAR encouraged us to have with practitioners, with people who wanted practical answers, that we started to turn our attention to, okay, what is it that people actually need in order to deliver better services, to deliver better systems of support, and to deal with the kinds of issues of development and application that we're going to talk about this evening. Well, again, when we do that, I think there's kind of 5 principles that I would kind of divine from our work. The first, and hopefully I've made that point already, is that social identities matter. The second is that self-categorizations matter. What I mean by that is it's not the way, I've talked about social identity group memberships as important, but the critical issue there is the group memberships that we ascribe to ourselves. And one of the problems in psychology and other disciplines, sociology, epidemiology, is that often we make assumptions about the identities that matter to other people. Oh, you're a woman, therefore your gender identity must be very important to you. Well, sometimes it will be, and sometimes it won't. And we have to take, as psychologists, as practitioners, go to effort to ascertain what identities it is that matter to people, and that are going to furnish them with the sort of healing powers that I've ascribed to those group memberships. And if we misunderstand people's identities and we don't make any effort to understand how they understand themselves, we will almost always, and this is a big theme of John's research, we will almost always get the answers and the solutions wrong. I came from a background in organizational psychology. If you live in an organization and you meet your head of command, they will present you with an organizational chart which looks like that. It's lovely and neat, and everything's organized. And of course, one of the nice things about that is it makes it easy to see how you're going to restructure the organization. You just split it down the middle, okay, or something like that, if we're going to do it. But actually, what organizations are like to their members is more like that, okay? They're just, and if you don't pay attention to identities in the processes of, for example, organizational change, and again, this work by Yolanda and other people in the audience here speaks much more powerfully to this than any work I've done, you see that you get it wrong. You make people stressed, dysfunctional, and indeed you get suboptimal organizational outcomes. And if you raise that to the level of society, if you misengineer change, whether it's in your immigration policy or your health policy or your education policy, if you don't attend to social identities in the way that they matter to their members, you will get the wrong answer, and it will cost you a lot of money. The third point is that the power of social identities is unlocked by working with them, not across or against them. Again, having understood what identities matter to people, then you have to work with those identities to unlock their power. And too often, organizations, societies, leaders, they discover what matters to people and then they just go off and do something else. And again, actually, the key to mobilizing the power of groups is to work with them. And again, that's a theme that I think dovetails with where John is going to take us later. Related to that, what are you doing in that process? What are you making social identities matter? We have to have a world in which people can live out the valued identities they have, the valued cultural identities. And if you suppress those identities or you communicate to people a sense that they don't matter, again, you will get suboptimal outcomes on a range of different measures. And the final point is that whatever you do in the world, whether you're a psychologist or a politician or an economist, and you talk about intervention, that intervention is always political. In some sense, you already know that. And the reason it's political is because it has implications for people's social identities. And either that unlocks their potential and works with them to create a better world, or it doesn't. And again, I think part of the power of our broader analysis is it allows us to understand the kind of political sensitivity of the work that we're doing, but also to reveal what is sometimes understood to be just driven purely by data. No, there are ideologies and other things at play which sometimes interfere with getting to the right solutions. And again, I'm not here just to drum up support for John's talk, but that's a theme that's very much implicit or explicit in everything that he's going to talk about. Just one very practical program that we're kind of initiating, because again, part of this also feeds back into education, again, with colleagues at the University of Queensland, but also linking in with work by, again, other CFA members and other colleagues around the world. We're kind of trying to develop a program which is called Groups for Health, and this is built around kind of 4 principles, which again speak to some of the points that I've been making, and what we call the 4 S's. The first is schooling. We have to kind of get the message out. We have to explain why social identities matter and kind of engage people in this debate. Secondly, we have to scope, which is what we call scoping. You have to find out, again, about the identities that matter to people. Then you have to source those identities. You have to provide a basis for people to connect with groups that matter to them and to kind of work with them. And finally, you have to provide scaffolding. You have where you're providing support or infrastructure or various other kinds of activities that are designed to bolster identity, you have to provide appropriate kind of scaffolding. And then the kind of, as it were implicitly, the kind of 5th S is this is an ongoing process. You can't kind of do this once and just forget about it. We've dealt with identity. Identity concerns remanifest themselves all the time. And this is, again, a theme, if any of you have ever heard me talk about leadership. Great leaders become successful because they mobilize identity. They speak to us, for us, and they advance, they create, advance, represent, and embed our shared interests. Where most leaders fail is because they stop thinking that they need to do those things. They think they've got the kind of group sorted, or they become arrogant. And again, I think, again, part of what we're saying is this is an ongoing process of engagement with groups and the realities of group life. This is the final slide, just to say this is an evidence-based model that I think has broad appeal and applicability, not just for theorists, but I think increasingly for practitioners and policymakers, and we're now starting to work with groups really around the world in this translational process. And the final point then is that it allows us to appreciate and come to grips with the social determinants of health and to see why attention to these is essential to achieve population-level medical advance. Again, I've sketched out the very bare bones of this analysis, just giving you some kind of touch points for the kinds of things we're interested in. I hope it's kind of stimulated some thoughts in you and perhaps some provocative questions. And of course, there's a conversation that we want to continue long after tonight. But again, I want to thank you for giving us the opportunity to initiate that conversation and to those who've allowed us to do so. Thank you very much.
Good evening, everyone. I know I'm in the Caribbean when people respond to a public greeting. It doesn't happen very often outside the Caribbean. Like Alex, I want to thank the sponsors of this evening's meeting, CFAR and the Aga Khan Foundation, and others who have worked to make this possible. My presentation is, in a sense, rooted in what Alex has shared with you. He's made a very broad case for why social interactions and social identities are an essential foundation for personal and, of course, group well-being. I want to build on that by focusing on some very particular examples or cases. First of all, I want to say something about development and sustainable development, which is, of course, one of the main interests of the Aga Khan Foundation. And then I want to say something about peoples, groups, and individuals in culturally diverse or plural societies, which is a second major focus of the Aga Khan Foundation. Recently, I came across a WHO report that asserted, almost obviously, that you can't have development if everybody's sick. And since sustainable development is in the title of tonight's discussion, you can't have sustainable development unless you find ways to sustain people's well-being across their lifetime and over generations. My particular interest is in these societies which are culturally diverse or culturally plural, and most of my work over the past 30, 40 years has been with peoples who are culturally diverse in these societies. Much of what I will share with you, and I'll only have a few examples beyond giving you the foundations for them, stems from a collaboration, an international collaboration, much as Alex's work has. I have a project going on in over 20 societies with different populations called Mutual Intercultural Relations and Well-Being in culturally plural societies. Sometimes with indigenous peoples, sometimes with refugees, sometimes with migrants, international migrants, as well as rural to urban migrants, sometimes with, dare I mention it, temporary foreign workers, and other populations that are exposed to living with their own culture simultaneously with other cultures. And in this slide, it's a very minimal case. You have something called the larger society, a kind of civic framework, a political framework, a moral framework within which all people are trying to live with their cultural differences. And the focal case there is an individual or group with a particular heritage culture. These can be, for example, Icelandic or Ukrainian or Chinese Canadians living in Canada, or indigenous peoples. And they intersect with other groups that have other different heritage cultures, all of whom are trying to forge a new life, a new way of living, new identities, new ways of trying to succeed in this new society. There are at least 4 ways or strategies in which such groups and individuals can try to live. They can try to engage both groups, their own heritage group and the larger society. They can try to engage only their heritage group and turn their back on the larger society. Thirdly, they can try to engage only the larger society and turn their back on their heritage culture. And the worst case scenario, as we'll see, those who are marginalized from both and are not involved in either group. We can approach these 4 ways of trying to live together in these culturally diverse societies from 2 perspectives. The perspective of the non-dominant communities, be they indigenous or migrant or refugee or ethnocultural communities that have lived for generations following initial migration. And from the point of view of the larger society, the people who have shaped the institutions, the laws, and essentially control how people try to live together in these societies. Notice that I don't use the word minority and mainstream. I think these are silly terms. The larger society is clearly much more and more profoundly shaped by many forces than simply the continuation of the people who got to a country first and try to control it forever and ever. So this is an evolving notion of a larger society that is trying to come to grips with its diversity rather than imposing a single dominant way of life. Over the years, actually, it started when I emigrated to Australia to work with Aboriginal communities. I've been following these two issues that confront people in these intercultural situations in daily life. The first is, to what extent is it important for me to maintain my cultural identity, maintain my cultural attributes, qualities, and other features of my group's existence? And some people say it is very important, others all the way through to say, no, it's not important at all, I'm quite happy to give it up. And the second issue you see there is, to what extent do I want to have interactions, become involved with, engaged with people outside my own cultural community, not necessarily with the larger society only, but with other cultural groups in my society. And we refer to the option of being involved in both as an integration way or an integration strategy when we look at the point of view of the non-dominant communities, and we call it multiculturalism, at least in Canada we call it multiculturalism, when it is the way of living together from the point of view of the larger society, whether it's public policy or public attitudes. This is a framework that illustrates these different ways. On the left we have the non-dominant or ethnocultural groups, and on the right-hand side we have the dominant larger society. And the two issues, one is across the top, the maintenance of heritage, culture, and identity, and down the left-hand side, interacting with people outside my own group. And you can see these four terms, first of all for the ethnocultural groups, when people do not want to keep their heritage culture, they don't value it, but want to become fully involved, even absorbed into the larger society. That's an assimilation way of living. That corner, or you can't have a corner in a circle, of course, but that sector of that circle represents one way of trying to live interculturally, giving up your heritage, culture, and identity, and becoming fully absorbed and engaged with the larger society. The counterpart in the lower left hand is a separation strategy. People get fed up with being dominated, with being told how to live, and they turn their back on these influences from the dominant community and seek separation, whether it's Basque, Quebecois, Scottish, Frisian, whatever form of separation. We see these attitudes and these strategies being used. The lower right-hand corner of the sector of the left-hand circle, the marginalization, is when people are out of touch, out of contact, not engaged in, have no support from either their heritage culture or the larger society. And in the upper left is the integration strategy. They maintain a large degree of their cultural and identity integrity, and they become an integral part on those cultural terms with the larger society. People move around, they search how best to live, but the long-term strategy seems to settle on the integrative strategy, being what I will call doubly engaged in at least two and possibly more than two cultures, your own and that of the larger society. From the other point of view, the third issue, whose perspective are we taking? On the right-hand side, we have equivalent terms. The melting pot, as you well know, is when assimilation is expected. You will all become French, you will all become Australian. We don't like you keeping your heritage cultures. The counterpart is segregation. It's okay to be culturally different, but keep it to yourself in your own communities. That, by the way, is largely what multiculturalism has come to mean in much of Europe. It's okay to keep your religion, your dress, your values, your beliefs, but don't expect it to be penetrate the life of the larger society. Exclusion is the counterpart to marginalization, when the official policy or public attitudes is, we don't like you the way we are and we don't want you here anyway, please leave. And multiculturalism, and these are the two features of the Canadian multiculturalism policy, equally important: promotion of the sustaining of cultural identities and qualities, and at the same time full and equitable participation in the life of the larger society. increasingly people are misunderstanding multiculturalism as just the first. But it's absolutely essential that the second, the removal of barriers to full and equal participation, go hand in hand with the promotion of cultural diversity. What I'm in pursuit of in this 20-plus country study with all of these different populations is evidence that when people are multiply engaged in their, particularly in their heritage culture, have maintained a strong sense of their own identity, and at the same time are involved in the life of the larger society, they have better psychological, better social, and better physical health. And there are numerous examples that I could give, but because the time is short, Amy convinced me to settle on 2 on the slide, but I can give you another couple verbally. Migrant workers from villages to cities in China are a major phenomenon, as you know. Most of them don't have residence rights, they don't have health rights, they don't have schooling rights. And so they have a serious set of problems when they move to the cities. There are millions of these people. So in the city of Chongqing, which is the biggest city that you've never heard of, it's the center of the Yangtze River project, about 40 million people now. We looked at how migrants were trying to live in this new, very difficult set of circumstances. And what we found was, using a concept from environmental psychology, place identity, that those who maintain a strong sense of where they came from and identify and a value with their home village, and at the same time become involved in and try to make the best of their lives in the new massive city, the integration strategy, the double engagement, those people do substantially better on psychological and social tests of well-being than, in particular, those who are marginalized, and those who are trying to assimilate or separate are somewhere in between. As an aside, recently Michael Adams and Veronix completed the Urban Aboriginal People Study here in Canada, and in a secondary analysis of those data, you probably know over half of Aboriginal people in Canada live off-reserve in cities now. And those who maintained a strong sense of their home community, had links, visited often, and established close working networks in their cities, and there were 10 cities in Canada, had better health outcomes than those who turned their back on one or the other, or who were marginalized without links to either their home community or the new city. So migrant workers in China and urban Aboriginal people in Canada exemplify this. The second, you probably remember, there was a major earthquake in 2008 in the province of Sichuan in southwestern China. And with some colleagues there, we've been studying the impact of this on their lives and the resettlement in neighboring towns and cities. They had massive physical destruction and massive cultural destruction. This is with the Chang nationality. You probably know that China has 57 officially recognized nationalities, only one of which, the Han, we really know much about outside China. And so we constructed scales of identification with the Chang nationality, their home culture, and with the larger Han society. And those people who maintained a strong sense of their heritage, cultural identity with the Chang people, and began to be involved and take on some of the valued qualities of the Han societies in which they were living, had better psychological and social outcomes than those who were lost between them, marginalized, or those who chose either to turn their back on the new town and hanker only for their destroyed village, or who turned their back on their destroyed village and only oriented themselves. Another example here is, you may remember the James Bay Hydroelectric Project. I was involved in a before and after study of the relocation of the Cree following the destruction of their hunting territories. What we found that those who took advantage of the new opportunities provided by the relocated towns, and still maintained a sense of being on the land, trapping, hunting in the winter when they could, had better outcomes, health outcomes, than those who were completely marginalized by the situation. They no longer knew who they were. They weren't Cree, they weren't Quebecois, who were marginalized. Those differences, again, were very substantial. Third case, for which I have a slide. We have over 5,000 immigrant youth aged between 12 and 18, settled in 13 countries, including Australia, Canada, France, Germany, and so on. And we looked at the strategies they were using, assimilation, integration, and so on, and their psychological outcomes, what we call feeling well, and their sociocultural outcomes, doing well in the new society. And this slide may require just a bit of extra explanation. The horizontal line in the middle is a kind of neutral or midpoint. And the blue or purple bar on the left is the psychological outcome, and the red or maroon bar on the right of each is the sociocultural. And on the left, you have those who were pursuing the integration way of living in their new societies, followed by the separation or ethnic orientation, third, the assimilation or national orientation, finally, on the right, the diffuse or marginal situation. And what you see here is that both psychological and sociocultural well-being are positive for those pursuing the integration strategy, and that was about 36% of the sample. Better than those who were involved in a separation or ethnic orientation, but note that those people had good psychological well-being, but slightly lower sociocultural. The surprise, given that most people think adolescents are just gung-ho on getting involved in the larger society, turning their back on their heritage culture, note that their two indicators of well-being are negative for the assimilation or national orientation, and massively negative for those who are marginal or diffuse. They didn't know who they were. Just as an aside, these change over time. Those who were in the country for less than 6 years had almost half the people in the marginal category, and only about 20% integrated, and that completely reversed for the people who had been there 12 to 18 years. In other words, it took time for the kids to figure out that you could be both, and being both led to a greater sense of well-being. So, intercultural relations are a special case of social interactions. Most people in the world are involved in intercultural relations now because there are virtually no societies or no communities where you find only one people, one identity, one language, one sense of way to live. And so the question is, how do they make sense? And does it matter how they make sense of living interculturally for their well-being? And I've argued that there are at least these 4 different ways of living. And I've argued that the integration principle is pretty well established now, that when you are doubly engaged, when you don't give up on your heritage and at the same time seek to be involved, which are the 2 principles underlying multiculturalism policy, cultural maintenance and involvement, equitable involvement, then the outcomes for both psychological and sociocultural well-being are superior, particularly superior to those who are lost, caught in between, but also superior to those who are assimilating or who are trying to separate. So, people in these situations have to work out, and by people I don't mean just the non-dominant groups, I mean the larger society. You have to work out in collaboration so that you're on the same page. Because if somebody, as an individual, is trying to assimilate, and the larger society, the public attitudes and public policy is, we don't want you here, so we won't let you in, you can't assimilate, then they're not on the same page, and that causes a good deal of stress. Similarly, if you a person is trying to integrate, in other words, maintain their culture, and on that basis become fully involved in the larger society. If the larger society says, no, you keep it to yourself, we don't like you wearing that dress, we don't like you eating that food, we don't like you speaking that language in our institutions, then integration won't be possible because they're not on the same page as the people in the larger society. So we have to have an interactive or a mutual approach, which is the name of the project I mentioned, the Mutual Intercultural Relations and Well-Being. So you can, I think, create a positive atmosphere by changing social policy and changing public attitudes in order to allow people to engage in their new intercultural worlds in ways that lead to a greater well-being, and this, as I've argued, is the integrative or multiple or double engagement way of living interculturally. So I just got the 1-minute signal. I'll stop there. Thank you very much, and I hope we can have a pretty good discussion. You want that? No. Oh, we go up here.
Okay, so before we start the questions, I need to do a couple of housekeeping things. There are people apparently watching on the web. If they want to tweet questions to us at CFAR, I mean, where would they do it?
On the webcast platform.
On the webcast platform, okay. So please go ahead and do that if you'd like to. Also, when people in the room want to ask questions, are there going to be microphones? How are we going to? You have a microphone. Okay. Oh, so there are 2 microphones in the room at the back. I'm going to ask a couple of questions. I'd love it if you folks wanted to take over from there. Put your hands up, get my attention, and we'll go. I'm going to start with a question for Alex. When I was reading an article that he co-wrote in Scientific American Mind to try to get a sense of his work and this field, and it makes really intuitive sense that people who are engaged and belong are healthier. And the article actually talked about the fact that people used to feel that too many groups, belonging to too much, would actually drain you, but the thinking is now that the more engaged you are, the more invigorated that you are, and people are able to do much more as a consequence. And I'm a medical reporter, as was mentioned earlier, and lately one of the big buzz things is exercise and the lack of it, and people are actually thinking doctors should prescribe exercise to individuals, give them a prescription for exercise. So I'm wondering, should doctors be asking their patients about their connectivity or lack of it and prescribe them joining a group?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the first thing to note, just point of interest, is that 3 other co-authors, Nyla and Kath and Yolanda, are all in the room. So I'm speaking for them too, as a group. This is kind of our work. And I think that actually Yolanda wrote that line, but was that, yeah, we think actually doctors really should be saying, well, firstly, I think as a doctor, you want to be aware of the fact that some of the data is from our epidemiological studies that Kath and Tegan in particular have done, really point to the massive power that group memberships give you. A big study also showing that it's not just any old tie. Work by Kath has shown that group ties have a particular kind of kick over and above just interpersonal ties. I think that's, if you're in the medical industry, that's something you just need to know, and it's probably something that a drug company isn't going to tell you. And secondly, I think actually talking about exercise, Thomas Morton is sitting there, has done research with some of these same databases, and exercise is kind of good for you, but actually the real power of exercise comes from doing it in groups. So actually, again, we've done studies, and again, you show that where you get the kick from exercise is when you do it collaboratively. And work that Katie Greenway, a CFAR fellow, is doing is trying to work to create apps which allow people to connect with other people virtually, so that even if you're isolated, you can do that with people in other places. So actually, we have yet to find a kind of a health issue which does not have this distinctive group kick to remedy. And I think if you're in the business of providing remedies, that's something you need to be aware of, and it's something you need to be prescribing. Yes.
Okay. Can I just play devil's advocate and step back a little bit? As I was listening to you both speak, it occurred to me that, I'm not sure if this isn't a chicken and egg situation, belonging to groups makes you healthier, but isn't it also possible that people who are healthier are more inclined to belong to groups, and people who are less healthy emotionally are not joining groups? And so it's not that you have made a choice not to join or not join, that group membership is a marker of your psychological health?
Absolutely. And at some level that is definitely true. I mean, again, I think scientifically we can tackle that in two ways. One is in the epidemiological studies, you can look at reverse causal pathways, and you find some evidence of the pattern you're showing, but the evidence in the other direction is much kind of bigger. It's 5 times bigger if you want to say quantify it. And also we can do experimental studies, and we've done intervention studies. Again, I'm thinking of studies by Kath and Tegan and others, where again you take people who are vulnerable and marginalized in the way you say and have health difficulties, and you put them in groups and see does it do them any good, and the answer is yes. So again, but providing they internalize those group memberships. But that's I think a very important and legitimate scientific question, and it's one that we've invested quite a lot of energy in answering. And I wouldn't be giving you the answers I was if I didn't believe that we've answered that question very satisfactorily.
Okay.
Could I jump in
Please
on
do.
the chicken and egg issue? The biggest driver of how people try to live interculturally, which of these ways, and through that, the biggest driver of well-being is the perception of and experience of discrimination. People who are told that their cultures are not valuable, that we don't like the way you live, that you're not welcome here, please change or go, have the least likelihood of trying to assimilate or integrate, and the greatest likelihood of turning their back and trying to separate or just be marginalized, be left out, and greatest likelihood of having poor health outcomes. So which came first? Were the cultural practices that the larger society didn't appreciate the source of the discrimination, so you get a kind of circular antagonism? Or was it the discrimination already extant in the larger society that led people to say, well, if you don't like me, I don't like you. I'm not going to play your game, and turn our backs on the larger society. So when people's identities and cultures are threatened, there is this reciprocity. You don't like me, I don't like you. You like me, I will like you. So I think the power is in the hands of the larger society to begin the more positive dialogue. You are welcome. You contribute to our society. We want you to maintain the vibrancy. And what's the likely response? Hey, yes, let's do that. So you get the reciprocal positive. And so it's chicken and egg, egg and chicken, and it just goes in circles in that way.
We have a question already over here, I think. Hi.
This question's for Alex. I'm just wondering, Alex, what the effect of technology and social media has on the ability to design, develop, and implement different groups, whether it's with gaming or virtual reality or Skype or FaceTime or Facebook.
Well, as Helen before had a couple of questions she prepared, and she said she had that question. I said that's a question nowadays that's I think a question everybody wants the answer to. And again, that's one and actually in the CFAR group, John Halliwell, I don't know if he's here yet, but I think there's oh, he is here. Hi, John. So I think there's somewhat different views in our group, and I think we're trying to take an empirical perspective on that. So I think our view is providing the group, however it's materially realized, whether it's through virtual means or whatever, providing it is internalized and provides you with this sense of being part of something bigger than just me and part of us, is going to have those positive consequences. I think John's view is that to some extent a kind of virtual network is going to be not as good for well-being and may have relatively marginal benefits. I think it would make sense to imagine, and again, I'm going to keep mentioning everybody's names, but Kath and Katie and Tegan and others I know are looking at those questions. I think it makes sense to imagine that probably if you are going to do the virtual thing, it's probably going to be helpful to have it consolidated one way or the other through actual interaction from time to time. But the idea that real group memberships can't be buttressed and supported and sustained virtually, I think is implausible. And I think actually the power of technology to augment that kind of social experience is massive. But again, I think it's about having the right conversations. We're collaborating with design scientists, computer scientists, to put the psychology at the front end of the technology, not as happens in most IT environments at the end of the technology. So you only become interested in psychology once the system's failed and nobody wants to have anything to do with it, which has happened in the UK. It had a $10 billion investment in the IT system, and it meant to improve medical records in the UK. It was a complete failure, didn't deliver one positive outcome because the IT was at the front, not the psychology. So these are big questions. We're just starting to answer them. I think actually that's going to provide, we're hoping to renew our CFAR program, and that's one of the big questions we really want to address.
John, do you have something you want to add here?
I could mention there are some studies underway and some preliminary results. The isolation that leads to marginalization amongst migrants, particularly, say, international students, is beginning to be relieved by Skype and other forms of internet communication. The very first study I came across was Turkish international students in Texas. Well, you can imagine how isolated they felt. And this graduate student, her thesis was the impact over time with increased use of internet technology, particularly Skype, on the well-being of international students who are away from home, very often in isolated small pockets without much social support. So yes, I think that this will increase the likelihood of heritage, cultural, and identity maintenance, particularly amongst groups that might otherwise fall prey to marginalization, and hence increase the likelihood of greater well-being.
Okay, it reminds me of the debate between the benefits of e-learning and traditional learning. I'm in the Faculty of Education, so.
We have a question here, I think. And
I
then
have a question for John Barry concerning the plight of refugee camps and camps of internally displaced people. Now, this is a major problem that we face today. Is there anything in your research that could be used by the runners of those camps or the organizations behind the management of these camps that would lead to a better well-being of the people for the time that they're in their camps?
There is some work on this. I think the general principle that I promoted, the integration principle, is probably sound and can be used as a basis. So in camps, some people are going to be selected to go to countries of resettlement. Some people are going to be repatriated, the refoulement principle. And you would have to take a different approach if you knew reasonably in advance what the outcome was going to be for these individuals. A graduate student of mine, again, studied Guatemalan Mayan refugees in camps in southern Mexico. And those who, in her research, said they intended to return once the Civil War was over, they maintained a sense of their Guatemalan Mayan heritage and were more successful while living in the camp compared to those who said, no, I just want to get out. I don't want to be Mayan at all. So I think it's possible to do research in camps to find out how people see their life trajectories and then tailor the information, perhaps implemented in programs, to meet their particular goals. So yeah, I think that some of these principles are sufficiently established to begin to use them. But of course, in camp life, research, the necessities of life are front and center, and research would be a luxury, but if possible, that's the way I would go.
we have a question in the back here.
Good afternoon. Is this on?
No.
Hello? Okay. Thank you. My name is Rob Martin. I'll identify my social identity as a Canadian citizen. I've lost a lot of my other identity. My question involves mental health, and specifically, I won't hijack with sustainable development, but the perspective of post-traumatic stress disorder and the impact on the isolation and marginalization of post-traumatic stress disorder survivors, and link with the Canadian Institute for Mental and Military and Veterans Health Research. I guess my question is, I'm a war survivor, post-traumatic stress disorder survivor, and everything you're saying there, I'm in the isolated, marginalized group in Canada. Yeah. Is there work in between the two institutions for research to address post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well, certainly stress and PTSD is something that has been a focus of some of our works. Orla Muldoon is here, I think, and she's done work with victims of trauma in Northern Ireland, and has, I think, her narrative of that research is very much aligned with the sort of stuff I'm talking about. But I think a critical part of the remediation process, I think there are two kind of elements from that body of research that come through very clearly. One is that the key pathway to improvement is to come together in groups and to with other people who've had those experiences, and to have some experience of collective voice. And also where Steve Reicher and Blarina Kalezic have done work with trauma survivors in the Balkans, and again their work shows the same thing, that actually if one of the key things that seems to precipitate PTSD is having to bottle it up and not being ashamed of your experiences, not having other people to talk about it with. But if you find a place in which you can kind of discuss your experiences and not feel all those negative things and valorize them in a particular kind of way within that community, get that voice. That's critical to the sense of solidarity, getting empowerment, and in a sense also dealing with some of the kind of political stresses around your status as a marginalized group, so that you're not heard and you aren't given in that the sort of scaffolding that's going to help you as a group get the material resources you need to get to a better place. Of course, part of the point from the kind of perspective of the dominant group, and talk about Australia or other countries, is that, of course, they've wanted to suppress those groups. They've wanted to present that it is just an individualized problem. And going back to the First World War, the people who have those traumas, they're just people who are weak or not very, very resilient, or this doesn't really exist, this phenomenon. And that's really the voice of the dominant group, who, of course, don't want people to mobilize for the form of political action that will get their voice heard and get the forms of change and remediation that are needed to improve their condition.
The normalization of this experience, perhaps led by Senator Dallaire, to say, it's okay, lots of us have this, please accept us as we are, please understand our issues. So it's the mutual, it's not just separating off into a group of PTSD survivors, but having that group recognized and accepted for who they are by the larger society, that will take the pressure off and change a separation group into an integration strategy.
We have a question over there, and then up here. You had somebody over there? Yes.
David Nosbacken. I'm a fellow of the McLuhan Center for Culture and Technology at the University of Toronto. Our research is in the interface. It's an interdisciplinary approach to look at the interface between digital technologies in particular, social fabric, community, and identity. And I guess the first speaker really identified what I wanted to speak about. It was missing in your presentations, and I understand why, but I really think this cannot be a marginalized matter. You know, when everybody can see and hear the same thing at the same time, metaphorically speaking, and where our children are forming these social groups that we may not understand yet. In fact, in the digital world, for the first time, children are the authorities. The only exception to that, perhaps, is immigration, where the children learn language before their parents. But I guess the profundity of the impact of digital technology in terms of social movement, cultural identity, and personal well-being is now a fundamental matter that needs to be included in your research.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, and again, I welcome the opportunity to have these kinds of meetings and make those kinds of contacts, because I think that's all the time we're trying to. And again, it's quite difficult. I think I mean, the model that John has presented is also a model of science in many ways. That often we have separatist communities, and we're encouraged to corral ourselves into groups as psychologists or whatever. And I think actually the broader goals of integrating to an integrative science, which allows productive dialogue across disciplinary boundaries, is a critical goal in itself. And again, I think the power of these kinds of events to allow those discussions to take place, or to open doorways to them. But I think there's dozens of people in this room who want to have conversation with you and say, well, look, we'd like to exchange ideas, because I think you're absolutely right. And I think there's a problem if psychology doesn't have the best of the kind of IT, information technology kind of research, and similarly if IT researchers are constrained by the psychology they're getting hold of. And often I feel that the tyranny of separatism in the scientific domain is often you get the worst of all worlds. You end up talking to the crap scientists from the other community.
John, do you want to add anything to that? No. Okay.
Good punchline.
Question here.
My question is my question is more general, and it's to do with your research. The results that you're getting from your research. Are you working with governments, at policy level to help with issues that affect countries? For instance, the unemployment issue. You'll get xenophobia, I think that's the word, where the indigenous people feel that the foreigners are taking the jobs away, but that's because probably the skills are missing or they're lacking. So is the information going to the people, so that they become aware that this situation is like this because of this and that? And, are you advising governments, to...
Yes, the answer is yes, when they're interested. The Canadian government over the years has been quite open to the social science community. They have an event called Breakfast on the Hill, where the Social Science Federation proposes a researcher to talk about their results that have public policy implications. And from 8 till 9:30 in the morning, the ministers, deputy ministers, members of parliament, other bureaucrats and reporters assemble and hear what is to be said, and then of course it's up to them what they do with it. I presented my immigrant youth study, for example. That, I think, is a fairly positive relationship, and when I explain this relationship to people in Europe, they throw up their hands and say, we couldn't possibly have any government officials listen to us in any serious way, which is my second example. Estonia, when it achieved its independence in 1991, they were fully fully absorbed into the Soviet Union. They were a Soviet republic, unlike, say, Poland or Czechoslovakia, which were independent countries, part of the Soviet system. And a large chunk of their population was moved to Siberia and replaced by a large number of Russian people. On independence, 40% of their population had Russian nationality, but Soviet citizenship, and no longer was there a Soviet Union, so they were stateless. The Estonian government had the choice of saying, we welcome you. Many were born in Estonia. We welcome you as a cultural community with a long history, and even though you were brought here against your will. Or they could say, we will accept you only if you take an Estonian identity, learn Estonian language, give up Estonia, give up your Russian schools, and give up your Russian identity. And I've been trying to convince them on the basis of research. I've met with a number of ministers of population and ethnic affairs, to no avail. The more they threaten the Russians by saying, we don't like you to be Russian, the more Russian they become. And the less likely it is that they're ever going to be fully participants in this new, emerging, evolving Estonian society. My current appointment in the university, National Research University in Moscow, is looking at the same issues with respect to the Central Asian peoples. And it started with the Ukrainian, but it got stopped pretty quickly in the last couple of months. So yeah, we can try to bring this material, this information, these suggestions, these general principles of how to run a plural society to the attention of governments. It's up to them what they do with it.
I think we have a question from the internet, do we?
Yeah, this question comes from the web, from Nabil. She asks, should programs that emphasize group activities receive funding priority above those that do not explicitly support it?
Well, I mean, I think that's maybe a bit radical. I would just start by saying programs that emphasize the value of funding or group activities should receive funding, which would be a kind of a starting point. So I don't, and again, it's like medical, it's not like we're saying I don't want to have medical research. I just think you need to create space for funding the kind of research that we're doing, and you have to see part of your funding portfolio. So again, I think it would be in the spirit, again, of John's talk, if it's about pluralism or organic pluralism, I think it's about creating space for all kinds of approaches to the topic, and I'm just trying to make the case for, and I think the empirical case is very strong, for valuing group connectedness as a key part of any health solution, and that funding research and programs that promise to deliver that, and I think where those are evidence-based, and we're working hard, and I know there's lots of other people here working very hard to build up that evidence base, and I think it's very compelling. I think to support that I think is a good idea, but I'm not arguing for taking away money from other research. I think that's not the way I think about the research I'm doing or we're doing, I think.
Okay, I've been given the 1 minute signal, but you've been waiting really patiently, so I'm just going to let you slip right in there.
My question will probably last a minute, but my name's Claudine Bennett, and I'm a registered nurse, and I'm a manager in public health, and I'm a knowledge user and a decision maker. I'm not well, I dabble in a little bit of research with you guys, but I have some interesting opportunities perhaps for people in this room. The region of Peel is home to 50% of immigrants in our region, which is Brampton, Caledon, and Mississauga, just outside of Toronto. 60% of our population who are parents are immigrants. I work in the world of promoting early child development, and we have just stumbled upon this idea that creating social connections amongst new parents could promote their well-being in an area where there are, where it's quite pluralistic. There are, lots and lots of new immigrants, lots of immigrants who've been there for a long time, but not, I would say, in your definition, entirely integrated, with women being quite isolated in homes, and in suburbia, lots of women who aren't immigrants just isolated by the mere fact they live on some street and there are no people for them to talk to because everyone is at work. And so I'm really happy that I got this invite into my inbox, because it's not an area that I'm familiar with, but I'm really interested in talking to people about that over the next couple days. And we'd love to work on some interventions in our community and work with some of you to research our findings.
Yeah, well, I think I think that opportunity maps very much onto the kind of that 4S kind of program I'm talking about, where you're trying to understand the value of things and then doing the sourcing and scaffolding and so on, because I think that's obviously critical. It's not just about creating groups, it's creating the right groups that are going to sustain the identities that are going to matter to those mothers, and there's a mixture of ethnicity and their class or their neighborhood and all those kinds of things. So I think, again, I think often those kinds of initiatives fail because another way of framing a lot of things I'm talking about is it's about identity realization rather than identity imposition. So it's not just about saying, okay, we're going to create these groups and you can slot into them. It's saying, what groups do you need, and let's help to provide those to allow you to reach those possibilities. And I think what you see is if people are given opportunities, they naturally find those groups. But again, often there's material and other structural barriers that stop those coming to the fore. And John has a lot of work about kind of wealth. One of the things that wealth does is it allows you to access that social capital, those social group networks more effectively. And one of the things that poverty does, and for example, reduce public transport and other kinds of things and welfare, is that they inhibit those opportunities. And I think providing structured intervention to facilitate those social forms of meaningful social capital, social connection is critical. But I think there are plenty of people in the room who'd like to talk to you about that, and maybe think about ways that we could support that and study it. I think, because I think that's exactly the kind of project we see as being of great value.
I just have one brief comment. In our immigrant youth study, we also included parents. And one of the outcomes is that within a family, you find all the different strategies that you could imagine. And the greater the difference in strategies, the greater the difference in identities, the greater the difficulties for the young people. So if you're working with families, find out how they're trying, each individual, how they're trying to live, and whether there's any consensus that can be built. And then with respect to group membership, is there any advantage in putting all the, say, the housewives who are marginalized together in a group? I'm not sure. Possibly yes, possibly not. But first you need to know how they're trying to live before you can begin to engage in any intervention. They're very different.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. You've made my job easy. You did what you were supposed to and asked very interesting questions, and we all really appreciate the input and the opportunity to explore these issues. So thank you very much.
I just wanted to thank Alex and John for the fascinating research and the discussion, and Helen for your moderating questions and directing the microphone traffic too. And it's a good research crowd. I know you know and appreciate the value of evidence. So please, you'll all be getting an evaluation form sent to your inbox. So please fill it out, and you'll also find information on how to keep in touch with both Aga Khan Foundation Canada and with CFAR through our e-communities. So now, I'd like, for the good of your health, you can continue to mingle outside of the atrium and continue the conversation. Thanks.